Good evening. My name is Tania Melendez Escalante, and I am Senior Curator of Education and Public Programs at the Museum at MFIT. Welcome to the Museum at MFIT's Fashion Culture Program Series. Tonight, we are honored to welcome author Maureen Footer and our Deputy Director, Patricia Mears. They will discuss Dior and His Decorators, the first book devoted to two interior designers who worked closely with Christian Dior. At the end of today's talk, we will pass some cards if you want to ask any questions to our speakers, and they'll read them and answer them during the Q&A session. Also, the books are on sale at the entrance of the venue. We will have a book signing at the end of tonight's talk. And we hope you enjoy the show. Thank you, Maureen and Patricia.
Tanya, thank you so much, and I'm beyond excited. We're thrilled to be back. The Museum at MFIT is in full swing again with our programs, and who better than this beautiful and brilliant lady, Maureen Footer, to join us today. You know, it's so interesting, Maureen, we've been talking, she and I spent a lot of time probably talking 10 times longer than the program today, about this incredible book that touches on two very important, but I think somewhat disconnected things. You love fashion, we love interiors, but very few people have ever put the two together, so we're going to delve into that. But I will say, if you're going to add anything to your library, if you love anything about fashion and certainly about design, this is the book. It's a must-have, and it's really a pitch-perfect balance between scholarship as well as beauty, a rare, rare thing indeed. So, Maureen, let's just launch right on in. How did it come about? How did you come up with this idea?
My previous book had been on a pivotal interior designer, George Stacy, who was a Francophile. He'd had a chateau outside of Paris in the Yvelines, an apartment in Paris, and he'd had a job exporting French furniture from Paris in the 1920s. To really piece them all together, I found myself going back and forth to France all the time, and I was delving into archives here at MFIT, at the Metropolitan Museum, at the New York Public Library, but there's still some magazines that I didn't want to see on microfiche. I really wanted to see the actual magazine, and I had to turn page after page in French libraries. And I started bumping into these two gorgeous French names, Georges Geffroy and Victor Grandpierre. And being a Francophile and being interested in design, I thought, who are these people? There was so little awareness of them. Right. And that was just the challenge. I really wanted to dive in. And then the most exciting thing happened. It turned out that they were personally, profoundly connected with Christian Dior. And they also worked for Christian Dior. And they also had personal experience in fashion. And I love the decorative arts. I really believe that not just the decorative arts, the applied arts. I really feel that because they're so personal, because they weave into our life on an everyday basis, that they really do tell the story of a point in time. They tell us what our aspirations are, how we want to present ourselves, what our ideal selves are, what materials are accessible to us, what technology we're working with, what we might be rebelling against in our past, and they just come alive. And suddenly, with all these connections between fashion and design, through the lens of Christian Dior, I thought, aha, here is this moment to explore, is there a parallel response in interior design that Christian Dior was doing in haute couture? That was the genesis of the book.
Perfect. I think what's so interesting is that, like you said, the three men intersected. What was their world like? How did they meet? How did they come together? The sort of meeting of the minds. What was happening in France throughout their career, really?
It's so interesting. All these three men were born within 2 years of each other. They were all Parisians. They were essentially contemporaries. They moved in similar circles. Georges Geffroy met Christian Dior in the 1920s when Dior was studying music composition, and then he went off into run a gallery of contemporary art. At that time, Geoffroy was going through his own sort of wandering years. He started out designing film sets, then he worked for Patou and Poiret, and then Michel de Bruneuf. Is it Michel, the head of Vogue?
Yes.
Because his brother wrote Babar,
Right.
and I always mix them up.
Exactly.
Took him under his wing, and he increasingly, and Charles de Bestigui, and he went into an interior design. But he and Dior connected doing amateur theatrics and running around Le Boeuf sur le Toit, which was sort of the nexus of artistic life and nightclubbing in Paris in the 1920s. So that's how they connected. Victor Grandpierre was a photographer, a photojournalist. He wrote some poetry. He too dabbled, did some set design as well. During World War II, Dior and Grandpierre both ended up living in Cannes, or the south of France, to avoid occupied Paris. And they met on a theatrical set. Dior did costume design. He was interested in theater. Grandpierre, at that time, was partly managing this little amateur theater group. They immediately had this connection. They'd had similar backgrounds and sensibilities, and became very close friends.
Wow.
Christian Dior, every New Year's Day, had an annual, fairly intimate party, and Grandpierre was one of the stalwarts that came year after year after year.
It's so perfect. You know, we talked a lot about not only their backgrounds and similarities, and these men were all design polymaths in many ways, but they had a shared sensibility about resurrecting and sort of being the custodians, if you will, of French culture. The Ancien Regime, the 18th century in France, and then subsequent revivals, especially through the lens of the Belle Époque, were very, very important. And Maureen, I think this is an underlying thread that is so brilliantly written into the book, but you make a really good point that they're modernists. And I want to, with the next few slides, sort of have you talk us through the Dior aesthetic. What was it, how did it work, and how do they utilize elements of the past as well as mindset of the period as well as looking to the future?
Right, okay. Looking at the first slide, we're looking at the landing of his couture house designed by Victor Grandpierre. Victor Grandpierre and Dior were both Parisians. They'd come of age in the Belle Époque. And at that time, there was this efflorescence of the Louis XVI style. It started with Napoleon III because his wife Eugénie was fascinated by Marie Antoinette, and suddenly Marie Antoinette, who had all of this Ancien Regime had pretty much been, was just not part of the conversation. Suddenly Versailles, Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette all came back into vogue. And the interiors in Paris became these Haussmannian interiors with these light pastels, grays, whites. They were airy. This was all part of the sensibility that both Dior and Grandpierre were nostalgic about. This is what Dior wanted to use to exhibit his clothes in his couture house. But at the same time, these men were constantly in touch with what was going on, not in museums, but in contemporary society. They were at Le Boeuf sur le Toit. They were friends with Christian Dior. Grandpierre was literary. He'd run a speakers series with people like Malraux speaking. He was a photographer, which at that time was a relatively modern art form. It was really questionable whether it was an art form at that point. But they brought all of this to the work, stripped it down, so they had references. The colors, the architecture, the structure was essentially a reference to this grand, glorious past, but it was really pared down and simplified. There were no decorations, excessive furniture, or extraneous elements in the couture house. And this was by design. They wanted something that was, and Dior was a frustrated architect, so they wanted something that was linear, that showed that structure, that respected it, and didn't get overwhelmed by the frou-frou and the extraneous.
You know, it's so interesting you make this point, because I just love this particular dress, just the bonbon of a dress in the shoe salon. But it seems like they were very smart about this too, because many clients were American, many clients were from Latin America. You had an international clientele as well. But they were smart about how to incorporate marketing and other elements. So they're looking at business. Maureen, how does this come together when they were putting the couture house together? Because it's not just the couture salon that was in the building.
Right. Well, I think what's so interesting is both Dior and Grandpierre felt that they weren't just designing clothes or interiors. They were designing, and I really believe this because I think they're so reflective of the society, they were designing an entire ethos.
Yes.
Dior was designing dresses, but they weren't these inanimate objects. They were things to be worn, things that supported your lifestyle. And the same with interiors too. They were stage sets for life. When Grandpierre started working on the Dior couture house, he certainly did the most functional part first, the interiors, but also he extended that language. So in addition to the gray and white and the simple neoclassicism of those interiors, he chose the font for all of the communications. Dior is based D-I-O-R, which is still the logo and still is it's on the shopping bags today, is based on an 18th century font called Bodoni. And it was Grandpierre that determined that that would be the font. The simple black and white communications, there were no sketchy Dali elements as at Schiaparelli or Vertege or whatever. Right. It was just graphic, clean, and simple. Same thing happened with the perfume bottles. Dior, believing that he was creating something holistic, not just clothes, had a perfume that he wanted to launch at the same moment that he opened his first collection. It was Miss Dior. And they were looking at bottles, and they were all very pretty crystal bottles from Baccarat or wherever. Grandpierre took one look at it and said, but this looks just like Madame Rochat, especially. And it's not reinforcing our message, which is this Louis XVI modernity. He said, we've got to put 2 rings on it, so it's like a Grecian urn. And hence, that became the bottle for Dior. And he would also make sure that everything interwove. So Miss Dior, not in the high-end perfume, but I think in the eau de toilette, the eau de parfum, had a label that had black and white houndstooth on it. And that was because Grandpierre looked specifically at that first collection. There were tailored suits in houndstooth, and he appropriated that to create that coherence in the brand. So essentially, Grandpierre with Dior created a brand, and interestingly, that brand had this incredible durability. It still is the template for the House of Dior, even though Peter Marino has come and revised it. They never go far away from this underlying thematic world of Grandpierre.
And all the way down into the details, even the presentation where you have the perfume. They seem to do it internationally too. Didn't Grandpierre have input into the way things were sold even in America?
Absolutely. The first Dior boutique was in Caracas, and it literally was a reinterpretation of 30 Avenue Montaigne. You knew when you went into a Dior boutique, as you do to this day, you see the same iconography consistently that really creates the Dior universe.
Now, did they work together, Maureen, or was there a little back and forth? Did Dior acquiesce, knowing that Grandpierre was so good at detailing the elements down like that?
I think largely they were supported, but Dior was also a serious business operation. Dior was of Norman extraction, and the Normans are known as really astute, not necessarily tough, but highly responsible businessmen. Dior had an enormous backer, the richest man in France, and he really felt a responsibility to deliver returns on this investment in him. So Dior was very careful. He had an extraordinary business manager, and you do see in the archives is Grandpierre is creating these lovely little présentoirs for perfumes that all had to be done by hand. They were incredibly sophisticated, incredibly detailed, and you'd see this communication going between headquarters and the suits and Victor Grandpierre, like, okay, you've done it, we'll pay for it, but absolutely, this cannot continue this way. And of course, it always did, because it was so essential to what the Dior value proposition was.
We were talking a little bit about the statistics that in the early 1950s, haute couture accounted for more than 5% of France's GDP, and Dior alone, the company, accounted for 55% of that. So it'll give you some idea that they were on the right track.
But I just want to point out, tell me if we're going too far afield, but of that sales number at Dior, probably about 80% of it went to American clientele. And this was one of the great accomplishments at Dior. During World War II, the Parisian couture had been cut off from America. All of these Americans suddenly were buying their clothes in 7th Avenue and US outlets. 7th Avenue, which had once just produced manufactured clothes, generic clothes essentially, suddenly was developing people who turned out to be great talents. Norel came up at that time.
That's right.
Hattie Carnegie, Claire McCardle, Claire Potter. Suddenly, America not only was creating interesting clothes, but really active sports clothes that worked for the contemporary American woman.
Right.
France, after the war, was terrified they wouldn't get that market share back.
Right.
And that really propped up the whole couture industry. It was thanks to Dior that suddenly couture, fashion ideas and innovation were anchored in France. If you wanted to be fashionable, you absolutely had to reference the couture in Paris. It really took away a lot of the momentum on 7th Avenue.
Absolutely.
And for that reason, Dior became a postage stamp.
And the editors couldn't wait to get back to Paris. That was for sure. But they also loved designing and having beautiful homes to themselves. The whole concept of lifestyle permeated their private lives. So Grandpierre does the Dior brand, but when Dior does his own home, what are we starting to see, Maureen?
That's very interesting. Dior was extremely diplomatic. And he was very close to Victor Grandpierre, and they were soulmates to a certain extent. And he's so pleased with what Grandpierre did for the couture house. But he also had this long-standing relationship with another established interior designer. Grandpierre, up to the moment that Christian Dior asked him to do his couture house, had been a photojournalist. And it was actually very exciting because it immediately signaled to the world that things weren't going to happen the same way at Dior that they happened at all other couture houses. He went out on a limb, hired this photojournalist who'd done a little bit of set design, but really didn't know the interior design sources and whatever. And of course, he acquitted his responsibilities beautifully. Yeah. But there was also Georges Geffroy. And Geoffroy not only was an even older friend and a more established interior designer, but he had really turned Dior's fortune. I don't know if I've already mentioned this, but when Dior was sort of in a nadir in his life, his gallery had closed. It was the Depression. People didn't want to buy modern art. It was considered far too sketchy an investment. He was trying to reinvent himself. He was doing a little sketching, selling some of these things as an outside consultant to couture houses, but he hadn't really gotten traction. And it was Georges Geffroy who introduced Christian Dior to Robert Piguet, who hired Dior, and that was really what launched Dior into this wonderful trajectory that we know up to this day. So he also included Georges Geffroy, and the two of them pretty much divvied up the house. The two men didn't like each other, Geffroy and Grandpierre especially. They were very different temperaments. Grandpierre was very reflective, very serene, very interior. Georges Geffroy lived to be in society. And they just operated very differently, but they had a wonderful division of labor in this house, and the house is superb. Yeah.
just great. This is one of the shots of the interior. Maureen, what exactly are we looking at? What did Dior want? I mean, obviously, the couture house has specific business demands, but what did he want in his own life?
Dior himself, like all French people after World War II, were really looking for reassurance. France had just gone through an enormous trauma during World War II. They lost faith in their institutions. Their army didn't hold up. There was a lot of ambiguous morality going on, to say the least. The couture industry is decimated. And everybody wanted to go back to a moment where they could connect with the positive aspects of French culture, and they wanted homes, cocoons, that really reinforced all of this positive energy. So the house was, it had to be romantic, it had to be sumptuous, it had to be lush, but most of all, it had to be French. It had to really continue that lineage of great French culture that had started at Versailles, continued through 1950 when this house was done. But it also had to be contemporary, you know? So things happened in this living room. Can we just go back for a minute?
Yes, absolutely.
A proper French living room prior to World War II was a very formal room. You didn't lounge. They weren't sexy. They didn't embrace you. They weren't exuberant. They were for display of your signed furniture, of your family, of your lineage, of your taste, but they weren't inhabitable rooms. And I think you can see, looking at what Geoffroy did for Dior, that the colors explode, the walls are upholstered in velvet, there are little tables that you can play cards in, side tables with lamps where you can actually sit and read. I mean, these look very normal to us today, but it was Geoffroy and Grandpierre that pioneered this level of comfort and functionalism in French interiors.
Just absolutely gorgeous. But of course, the bathroom. And Maureen, you have this wonderful passage because everything in Dior's life seemed to be done at the highest level. He had a wonderful chef, but he also had a very special kind of butler.
Oh, yes. Talk about holistic. Dior really believed, just as much as he believed in the decorative arts, in music, in French couture, he adored French cuisine and loved to entertain. He also had to entertain Stanley Marcus and all these people continually. So this house was also built as much as for a showcase as a personal haven. But because this house was one designed for private and professional entertaining, he had to have a butler. And of course, the butler looked like something out of central casting. He was the most tall, aristocratic Spaniard in Paris. And people would always mention, you know, Dior and his chic accessory, the Spanish butler.
It's perfect. Now, Dior died tragically very young. In 1957, he was only 52. But these two gentlemen continued work. And we have a few slides of some of their commissions. This one and the next one are extraordinary, Maureen. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the client and what Geoffroy was doing for this particular home.
This photo and the next one are the house of the Comte and Comtesse de Bonchamp. And it's on the Avenue Foch. And the Comtesse de Bonchamp was an oil heiress from California. So Geoffroy did not like budgets. He was an extremist and over the top. And so this was a perfect marriage right there. But his challenge was that Avenue Foch doesn't typically have Haussmannian apartments. This was not one. It didn't have great architecture. It was built sort of nondescript luxury building from the 1930s. He essentially had to put interior architecture in place here. And he did. I mean, here you can see the floor is Parquet de Versailles. He's got these lovely columns. In the next slide, you'll see that there wasn't really moldings and architectural detail. Geoffroy had to supply it. So even the walls here are upholstered in velvet, a sort of signature Geoffroy detail, but he actually created these moldings which are called en gaine, which means they were all sheathed in velvet too. So this created interest and substituted for its lack of intrinsic architecture. The other thing that happens in this room is, once again, he creates this velvet-lined cocoon with these deep sofas. Hubert de Givenchy dressed Comtesse de Beauchamp, and he envied that sofa. I interviewed the Comtesse's daughter and said that after she died, Givenchy was just begging for that sofa, and they wouldn't sell it. He ended up going to their upholsterer, Ducour, and having it copied, but that sofa remains in the family to this day. But in addition to all this deep upholstery, which is novel in France, we're not just populating rooms with Louis XVI settees and chairs and fauteuils. These are deep upholstered pieces, and at the same time that it's comfortable, it's relatively spare.
Yes.
Again, what's in there is interesting, but it's not this over-the-top layer on layer kind of room. It's extremely edited. Every piece is very carefully selected, curated, and placed in this room. Not much was left to happenstance.
Absolutely gorgeous. And decorators loved it too. I know Mark Hampton and others just sang praises.
Yeah.
And I think we have to remember how novel and unique this room was at the time. It just blew people away.
Well, this and the preceding room was even more novel.
Yeah.
And this was the anteroom. When you walk in to the apartment, there's a gallery, then there's the anteroom, and you move into the living room. But it was, before there was a Michael Taylor doing these indoor-outdoor things, he's using garden ornaments. He's left the walls just the palest gray, very understated. The color is lovely, the details are lovely, but the fact that it was so minimalist and that in a grand apartment he was using garden ornaments in the
Extraordinary.
1950s
That
was really avant-garde.
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely. And this is another space I just adore.
This is Geoffroy again, working in velvet again. It is the apartment for Roberto Ricci, who is Nina Ricci's nephew, who took over the business when she died. Again, in different architecture. Surprisingly, not everything in France is extraordinary. And again, Geoffroy compensated by not only creating this arch ceiling and creating this nice rhythm of repeating lanterns, but he created this sense of faux paneling by upholstering it with nail heads. And the nail heads essentially spell out a contemporary rework.
And it does. It's just pitch perfect.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Now we're moving back to Victor Grandpierre.
That's right.
And Grandpierre, whereas Geoffroy, the work we've seen with Geoffroy, was in different architecture that he more than adequately compensated for, Grandpierre here gets to work with great 18th century architecture. This is the Château de la Motilly outside of Paris. It's a Louis XV jewel. And he has the sense, once again, to make it comfortable. This is a contemporary settee that we're looking at. It's deep. You can actually read in it or daydream or whatever. But he's also kept a very controlled palette. It's this gray-blue and this taupe, minimal elements, using the architecture with references to the 18th century, but it's really, again, not a replication, but an evolution of 18th century design in an 18th century house.
And he sort of changes tact a little bit, but at the same time, so beautiful.
Absolutely.
Done.
This is more Dior romantic, I think. A guest bedroom in the same chateau, and it's a classic French motif to take one fabric and use it everywhere. No complex little clever juxtapositions of various fabrics. It's just one lovely printed document, which is used lavishly. again, you know, there's a certain, in all of these rooms, there's a certain rationality to them, which is very refreshing.
Exactly, and it continues to the next generation too. We see the heir to Dior.
Yes.
Not only in terms of working at the couture house, eventually leaves shortly thereafter, but connecting to these men.
Yes. Yves Saint Laurent, as most of you probably know at FIT, left on unhappy terms from Christian Dior. He was the heir apparent. He adored Dior. Dior knew this was the man who could continue his tradition. And he did continue Dior's tradition. Dior, for all of his sumptuous clothes, was very interested in the moment, in ideas that moved things forward, and Saint Laurent did exactly that. I think the last straw for Saint Laurent at Dior was that he designed a motorcycle jacket in leather. And, you know, at that point, the business office said, you know, we can't take these risks here. And Pierre Berger and Saint Laurent went out and started their own house. When they started their own house, Berger told me that Saint Laurent was so attached to Dior that he wanted to reference his lineage with Dior, which in fact was part of a long lineage of couturiers in Paris. In fact, what Dior did that was so extraordinary is he revived techniques from the turn of the century that had disappeared in the age of Chanel and Patou and the flapper dresses of the 20s, or then in those bias-cut, beautiful Vionnet dresses of the 30s. These techniques were going to go extinct if someone didn't resuscitate them, which is exactly what Dior did.
Yes.
Anyway, so Dior's part of this lineage. Saint Laurent recognizes that he's part of it, and he has this personal connection with Dior. So when he established his couture house, his second one, it was the same business, but the first had been a small place in the 16th, and as Berger told me, after they launched their first perfume, I think it was Paris, they were in the money. So they bought the big house on the Avenue Marceau where the Saint Laurent Museum is now. But Yves Saint Laurent wanted to reinforce his identity with Dior and with Grandpierre. So he had Grandpierre come and do the entire couture house. And this is his office done for Saint Laurent. This is the early 70s. And we can see Grandpierre and Saint Laurent are sort of moving into a new direction because design always changes. There's new things in the air that we need to incorporate, new clients, and it's a very personal métier. You respond to your clients. You don't impose on them. So Saint Laurent in his Grandpierre interior. And Grandpierre went on, he actually started to do their country house in Normandy, which ultimately Jacques Grange finished. But Grandpierre had been the first choice. He had a stroke and it never quite recovered. But he had put in the famous Winter Garden that we see photographed over and over again is actually Grandpierre's big contribution. And also he created this flow of space in there that Grange decorated, but the architectural planning of the house was Grandpierre.
Maureen, I want to pivot back to you a little bit. I want to ask basically two questions about how long the process took, but also something that's very challenging, I think, for those of you who write and research, about having a voice that captures the reader and reflects the material. I think one of the things that you'll find if you haven't read the book yet is that Maureen has this vivacious quality, a somewhat French quality to her writing style. The book is footnotes up the wazoo, so there's no lack of academic background, but you don't feel burdened by it, Maureen. That was one of the pleasures. Of course, the pictures are gorgeous and you have such a great point of view as you're describing. Tell us about this. How long did it take and how was the process? How did you put the writing together to match the quality and the feeling of the time period?
Well, first of all, I had a great editor who's here this evening, Jacqueline Decter, and she really added so much to the process. But I really believe that to understand interiors or fashion, you can't just look at that element as an individual isolated aesthetic statement.
Right.
You can't understand it until you understand the context in which it was created. And it was more than just who was Victor Grandpierre, who was Geoffroy, but what was that civilization that they were reflecting? What was happening in their moment that was inspiring them? So I ended up spending a lot of time, besides trying to find these images of their interiors and know precisely what they were doing, but I wanted to see, first of all, what they were reading, what they were attending, what was going on. I read newspapers of the time. I wanted to find out what the debutantes were wearing before the new look came and how that transformed their lives. I wanted to find out what the nightclubs were they went to.
Sure.
So there became all this sort of contextual research. And I think when you have that, then the rooms come alive, the clothes come alive. You know, I had quotes from what men at the Jockey Club were saying about Dior at the time the new look first was unveiled. And, you know, all of that I loved. And I tried to share that because to me that's what animates these things. It's not just, oh, this is cerulean and, you know, it looks so good with green, or this is a signed piece of furniture and it's very fine, which I wanted to pay homage to too. But I think it was very important to make this come alive, and that's by understanding its historical context.
Does it help that you were a designer as well, an interior designer? Who...
It gave me a real appreciation for what was going on in these spaces, what the challenges are, how you create beauty and manage to find an equilibrium with function, what happens in those workrooms that creates these beautiful things. I was able, wonderful thing about France, talk about lineage, I was able to go to the upholsterer that did all of the work for Geoffroy, most of the work for Grandpierre. It was now on 2 generations removed from them, but you know, they, old Madame de Grandson had been a young girl when her mother-in-law was running the Geoffroy relationship, but she remembered Geoffroy. She was, you know, just taking the orders and writing things down and whatever. But she had these stories about it. They have archives of what's going on. To this day, decor, that upholsterer, exists. So, you know, going into this workroom and seeing this amazing work that started and has its roots in the 18th century in Versailles and is still being conserved by families and orally and in workrooms, so manually transmitted to other generations and conserved, was so exciting to me. But it also mirrored what was going on in the couture workrooms too. French couture can only do what they do because they have all of these satellite industries that do custom work that they subcontract out to. The people who make and dye the feathers, the people who make the silk flowers, the button makers, the beaters, the embroidery houses.
Right, exactly.
And, you know, this was, you know, part of the lineage that Dior respected. I read that when Dior had been at Laurent always was very aware of these disappearing métiers and wanted to conserve them and encourage them and made sure that he incorporated them in every collection.
Interesting.
Dior did the same thing. He always had in his evening gown collection at least 2 dresses embroidered by Rebé. Prohibitively expensive even then. Only Americans could order them. But you know, he might have liked embroidery quite a bit, but he also felt it was his responsibility to keep these métiers alive. And now Chanel is buying these métiers and making sure that they do continue.
It's absolutely.
It's wonderful to come from such a long heritage when the French are so aware of it and curate it and keep it ongoing, fresh, and applicable to contemporary life.
Great. Maureen, before I turn it over and ask for questions, I was wondering if you could offer, a little bit of advice for any young person who's interested in pursuing either design in these fields or researching it. And what surprises, because a lot of times when I start a project, I go in with some preconceived notions, and I'm sometimes right, but I find a lot of surprises that really redirects the way I think about things. And I'm wondering if both of these could be addressed.
For advice, I was so inspired actually researching Dior, Grandpierre, and Geoffroy. And they were all brilliant in their ultimate careers and had long-standing impact. I mean, to this day, we're creating gray and white rooms.
Yes.
To this day, we're using leopard. To this day, less so, although some of my favorite designers do, use all these bright, clear colors that were part of the new look design component. But what I really found impressive about these three men is that they weren't just pursuing on a narrow track interior design or couture. They were all very interested in their moment. Dior adored music. His best friend was the composer Henri Sauguet. He was listening and hearing what these contemporary dialogues and music were all about. He adored architecture. He was always following architecture. They all designed costumes or sets for theater and ballet, which I think really directly enhanced their work. They realized how to make big statements with minimal elements and how things moved. All of this came out of their practice in the theater. But so what I think made them so strong is that they were taking broad influences and it all distilled into their final artistic statements.
Yes.
But I don't think they could have created them without being so interested and a vital part of the world.
And you made a statement to me, I just learned this, Maureen's got a fabulous project. I'm going to ask you to tell them what's coming up soon with you. But you learned a little bit about that from one of the speakers that had been here at FIT.
Absolutely, and I love this story. I just told Patricia this evening, I wasn't ready to speak about it, but I just got a contract for a new book today. So now the cover is off the project.
Yes.
And it happened when I went to attend a symposium that Patricia had organized around their exhibit Ballerina, which was examining how ballet and couture had the synergies between ballet and couture. It was a fascinating day. COVID was just about to start that day, and I was kind of thinking, should I go out? It was just before lockdown, wasn't it?
That's
Patricia?
right. That's right.
And I was thinking, is this wise to go out? And gee, I could do all these other things. But I ultimately went. And it was there, in one of these serendipitous moments, that one of the speakers on dance mentioned a very obscure African-American choreographer. And I knew a lot about this world, and it was like, why don't I know this name? Suddenly, I was galvanized to find out more, just as I'd been galvanized when I couldn't find out much about Geoffroy and Grandpierre.
That's it.
And the more I dug, the more I thought, this man is revealing the entire story of America in the 20th century in his dance.
So perfect.
So it's turned into a book, but it's all because, like Grandpierre and Dior,
she was out there.
I went to a lecture at FIT that I almost didn't go to.
There you go. There you go. And in fact, one of the people asked, fascinating talk. What is your next project?
Well, there it is.
So there we are. Somebody had that. Maureen, these are very good questions. What do you think is a successful modern version of a fashion interior designer collaboration?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, the first and most obvious thing is I think Peter Marino is reinterpreting both Dior and Chanel in very relevant and interesting ways.
That's right.
But that's so obvious that you would have expected me to say that, right?
I think it's a really good question.
Help me, Patricia. What do you think?
You know why we picked her? Because we have a show up now, Dior Balenciaga. Perfect, right? But the next show that I'm doing is called Designing Women, Fashion Creators and Their Interiors, not the 1980s sitcom. But one of the things that we found fascinating throughout time is that interior design permeates all the aspects of these women's lives. We're really focusing on the period from the 1890s till about to the present day, but we're really focusing up until the 1970s. How their businesses, just like this, their personal lives, were all interwoven. And I would say someone who's really captured my imagination has been Anna Sui. Anna is not an interior designer, but her house is fascinating. If you get a chance, there are actually videos of it. And I wonder, Maureen, because I wanted to ask Anna, she just said that it's such a form of expression, that her place is very, very both personal, but it took a long time to create. If you watch Anna's apartment, the evolution, it's like watching a child grow up, and it did take a long time for her to do this. So in some cases, the collaborations, I think the ones that you mentioned are very important, from the large company, the heritage brand point of view, to the very personal. Anna's got a very small company, so you wouldn't think of her hiring a major name to design the house. But I think what you've proven here is that it's all across the map. Now, somebody has another very interesting question. You mentioned how the houndstooth pattern inspired a fragrance model. Were there any other couture details that made their way into the decor or marketing materials?
Absolutely, and you see them to this day in Dior. In their first couture house, they had a small little area under the stairs that they turned into their first boutique. And boutiques were really important because it's where spontaneous, not premeditated little purchases took place, and they really added a lot to the bottom line of labor-intensive, expensive, rarely cost-effective couture. Couture is almost always sort of a losing proposition until you start licensing it out, and that's where the money comes in. So this little boutique was important. And they started out making it gray and white, consistent with everything else at Dior. And Christian Dior, the artist, who was a close friend of Dior and Grandpierre, came through and said, you know, this could be livened up. What about Toile de Jouy? And Grandpierre, very understated, humble guy, didn't say, well, my idea was gray and it's my way or the highway. He immediately embraced this idea, went out and found a lovely toile that is still available at Geoffroy to this day.
Amazing.
But what is interesting about this toile is it continues to show up seasonally at Dior. They've used it for the past 3 or 4 seasons for various skirts and jackets and all sorts of incarnations. So what's interesting about that is that once the couture was influencing the brand, and now it's actually how the brand and the interior design is going back to influence the couture.
Fantastic.
And actually somebody just showed me, that ubiquitous little Dior, Lady Dior bag everywhere. If we go back to the cover of the book, this is Grandpierre's Winter Garden for Dior, and that is silk embroidery on that wall. They have now reinterpreted that embroidery and embroidered a Lady Dior bag on it. So it's so interesting how these seeds planted 75 years ago are constantly being reinterpreted in the Dior code.
This was an absolutely glorious period. Now, all of you, I expect you to be racing up to the top of the stairs to get the book. Maureen will be here. She'll be signing them for you. You can ask other questions. She's available for selfies. So, and we are, again, Maureen, we're so absolutely honored and delighted to have you here. Please join me in thanking Maureen Footer.
To thank Patricia for, first of all, introducing me to the topic of Buddy Bradley, but also for inviting me this evening. It was so wonderful to speak with you, who's so knowledgeable about fashion.
I'm a fan, you can tell.
Can so
I've read the book 3 times now.
Amplify this story for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen, so much.
And thank you all.